Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the Presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of William Taft, and the focus is Duty Calls, Dream Denied. The year is 1901. Things are actually falling into place for William Taft. In the Philippines, his American president, William McKinley, has been reelected. The insurrectionist, Emilio Aguinaldo, has finally been captured, so the insurrection in the Philippines is essentially over. And Taft is ready to take his oath as the first civilian governor general of the Philippines, fittingly on the 4th of July. It's actually a big celebration on behalf of Taft. He has been embraced by the Filipino people in part because of his engagement, his model of bringing the Filipinos into the discussion and ultimately into the government. So there's lots of cheers. Taft reiterates his commitment to the Philippines, and he's going to work even harder on their behalf. The first change is personal. General Arthur MacArthur, the military leader, is now out, so he moves out of the Malacanan Palace. The Tafts could move in. Nellie Taft is on cloud 9. She is essentially the First Lady of the Philippines. She's got servants, social events galore, and her husband is the most important person in the entire archipelago. She is sitting in a good spot. As for Taft, well, the work of his commission was expanded. He actually brought 3 Filipinos onto the commission, and he was just going to do more and more travel. Get out and meet the people, hold more hearings, eventually going to 30 different provinces throughout the islands. They had formalized the Municipal Government Act and the Provincial Government Law. And what did Taft do? He went out to explain this to the people, where they lived, patiently, in effect teaching the Filipinos self-government. They had never been involved in government before. The Spanish had run the Philippines for hundreds of years and had been overseeing that, and they took all the government roles. This was completely new. And another key element to this was simply education. The vast majority of the Filipinos were uneducated. More than 90% had not had any formal education. Taft almost immediately had imported about 600 teachers from the United States. This was a major commitment on the part of the Americans to expand the education as a key foundational element to ultimately self-government. Well, Taft's entire tenure in the Philippines had lots of twists and turns, and one of the biggest came in September 6, 1901, when the U.S. President William McKinley was shot. He was shot by an anarchist by the name of Czolgolsz at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. Well, there was some panic in the United States over this. There was actually maybe even more panic in the Philippines. They were seeing results under the policies of McKinley and Taft, and now what if the U.S. president would die? And sure enough, in a couple weeks, he did. But good news for the Philippines, at least, in terms of continuity of policy, because Theodore Roosevelt, Taft's longtime friend, is now the President of the United States, and Taft knew there was going to be no change in policy. He and Roosevelt had always been completely aligned on this, and he was able to reassure the Filipinos, despite this tragedy, the loss of the American president, there would be no change in policy. There was a change, though, for William Taft, because he also had a health problem, and it was a pretty big scare. With Nellie Taft on vacation in China, actually Taft was initially diagnosed as having dengue fever, but it wasn't getting better. And after a couple of weeks, a new diagnosis said he's got an abdominal abscess. This was pretty serious. Needed emergency surgery. They took him out of the palace in a stretcher, brought him to the Army hospital, kind of touch and go for the first 24 hours. After the first surgery, he needed a second. It looked like he was going to make it, but it was going to be a long path of rest needed for the recovery of William Taft. Well, Theodore Roosevelt, the new president, decided to call Taft home. He said, look, I want you to come home to rest, but he actually had another motive in mind, because originally Taft didn't want to go. He's committed to the Filipino people and the mission. He wanted to get healthy there and get back to work. But Roosevelt realized that the Congress was itchy a little bit about the Philippine policy. The House and Senate were both pending hearings about what was going on with respect to this policy, and Roosevelt knew the best advocate for that policy was William Taft. So he said, look, come home, rest up, come do these hearings, and when you're healthy and ready, you'll go back to the Philippines. So that's what he did. The Tafts came home, spent most of the time in Cincinnati. He actually needed a third surgery to again stabilize that abscess, but he eventually spent about 3 weeks being grilled on Capitol Hill by both House and Senate, but he did a fine job of actually representing the mission of the Philippines and what the Americans were trying to do. He told the Senate that a government suited to the present possibilities of the people, which shall gradually change, conferring more and more right upon the people to govern themselves, thus educating them in self-government until their knowledge of government, their knowledge of liberty, shall be such that further action may be taken. Taft's message: this is a tall order, we're making progress, let's stay on track, and he did a very credible job with the Congress at this time. Well, one of the most difficult issues that Taft had to face in the Philippines had to do with the Spanish friars. Now, the Philippines have been a Catholic nation now for the last several centuries. There were about 1,000 friars from Spain on the ground that eventually were the government representatives in each community. As Nellie Taft said, he, the friar, was simply everything in the parish. By law, he came to discharge many civil functions and to supervise, correct, or veto everything which was done or was sought to be done in the pueblo. In a word, he was the government of the parish. The problem was that the Filipinos resented these friars. They had taken the best land, they paid no taxes, authoritarian treatment, and so while they loved Catholicism, they didn't care for the Spanish friars. So in the recent insurrection, many of those friars were actually killed by the Filipinos. A number left the country on the run, and about the rest, they all went to Manila to hide. What Taft had to do is to figure out what to do not only with the friars, but importantly with all the land they owned. 400,000 acres of the best farmland in the Philippines were in the hand of these Spanish friars. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish-American War, dictated the respect of private property rights. So Taft knew, as a man of the law, he wasn't just going to take this land away from the friars. So he and Roosevelt, while he was in Washington, were conferred. And they said, you know what? We're going to have to go buy that land. And for that, Taft, you need to go to the Vatican, make a deal with the Pope. Little bit of a problem in this is the U.S. did not have any diplomatic relations at the time, did not recognize the Vatican. So Roosevelt was clear, this was not a diplomatic mission, it was a business transaction. Go and see what you can do to buy this land. Now, Nellie Taft was not able to make this trip. The Taft's son, Robert, had actually come down and was sick. So what had happened? Louisa, Taft's mother, invited herself. She said, look, if Nellie can't go, you're still not 100%, why don't I go with you? And she invited herself. She had the time of her life, and sure enough, she helped her son, still in his recovery mode. Well, Taft arrives in the Vatican. He meets with the Pope, Leo XIII. They agree that the Pope would set up a committee of cardinals to negotiate, and Taft spent about a month in these negotiations trying to buy this land. He wasn't able to finish the job, but he passed it on to his team. He had to get back to the Philippines. It took about a year, but they had a major success. They bought the land for about $7.5 million, and what the Americans did was they upfronted that cost, and then they sold the land in small increments, small parcels, the best farmland in the Philippines, back to the Filipino people. They were able to recoup their money. This was a major success for the people of the Philippines. The friars would never return to those parishes. This was a hard-fought battle from a diplomatic and business standpoint, and again, a major success. More and more people in the Philippines trusting that William Taft was the man who could come through for them. When he came back to the Philippines, there was this huge welcome, very popular. He was very committed to the slow and steady progress, and then a telegram arrived. Another one of these telegrams in the life of William Taft, turning his life upside down because his dream was about to come true with a telegram for the President of the United States that read, Taft, Manila. On January 1st, there will be a vacancy on the Supreme Court to which I earnestly desire to appoint you. I feel your duty is on the court unless you have decided not to adopt a judicial career. I greatly hope you will accept, would appreciate early answer, Roosevelt. Taft was conflicted. This was his dream job, the Supreme Court, but he was committed to the Philippines, the Filipino people, bringing them self-government. And in the end, he could not turn his back on them. And so he cabled back. Situation here most critical from economic standpoint. Change proposed would create much disappointment and lack of confidence among people. 2 years now to follow of greater importance to development of islands than previous 2 years. Look forward to the time when I can accept such an offer, but even if it is certain that it can never be repeated, I must now decline. Roosevelt accepted this. In fact, he said, if possible, your refusal on the ground you give makes me admire you and believe in you more than ever. But this wasn't the end of it. Just a month later, Roosevelt came back with another telegram. I'm sorry, old man, I have the greatest confidence in your judgment, but after all, old fellow, if you will permit me to say so, I am president and see the whole field. The responsibility for any error must ultimately come upon me, and therefore I cannot shirk this responsibility or in the last resort yield to anyone else's decision. If my judgment is against it, I need you on the court. And this, in fact, was much more of an order coming from the commander-in-chief. Well, Taft was still against this decision, but he served at the pleasure of the president. He eventually succumbed to this order or request. He relented, but it still wasn't over. There was another group of people who still had a say in that, and that was the Filipino people. So the next month, a couple of months later, January of 1903, they decided to hold a rally, a 2-day rally of songs and speeches to try to convince Taft to stay. There were placards all over town. Queremos Taft. We want Taft. There were young, old, men, women, rich, poor. Queremos Taft. Queremos Taft. It was relentless. And they weren't done just in the Philippines. Hundreds of telegrams were sent to the White House trying to convince the American president, this is the guy we trust. You've got to leave him here. And eventually, Theodore Roosevelt relented. He would have Taft stay. Taft would deny himself the pleasure of the Supreme Court that he had always wanted. He would stay in the Philippines. Well, he got back to work again, doing the foundational work, the hard work to continue the move to self-government. About 6 months later, Roosevelt came back. He had another change in his administration. Elihu, his Secretary of War that Taft reported to. Root had been in office now for a while. He had started under McKinley. It was time to go back to the private world, and so that created a big hole in the cabinet for Theodore Roosevelt, and his option was William Taft. This time, though, it was going to be different. Taft going to the court, he would be away from the Philippine issue. As Secretary of War, he'd be in charge. According to Roosevelt's cable, you will still have the ultimate control of the Philippine situation, and whatever was done would be under your immediate supervision. It seems to me, from the standpoint of the interests of the islands alone, you could well afford to take the place, which involves the general regulation, supervision, and control of the Philippine government. I need not say what an immense help it would be to me. Now, this was different. He would have a chance to actually still continue to oversee the activities in the Philippines while doing everything else on behalf of his president. One of the other things pushing him into accepting this job was, once again, Nellie Taft. She didn't want him to go to the Supreme Court. She did want him to take this job because a job in the cabinet was in line with the kind of career I wanted for him and expected him to have. This could perhaps get him to the presidency. Taft again was conflicted. He took 6 weeks. He eventually made the decision, you know what, because I can still oversee the work in the Philippines, I'll agree. He took his companion, trusted colleague Wright, put him in charge, and in fact, Wright would report to Taft. They would go out in style. Nellie Taft, again, was the first lady of the Philippines. She had a lot of big social events, and the biggest one of them all was still to come. They spent weeks planning what would turn out to be a costume party with a Venetian theme. Taft's big concern was, could they even make a costume big enough for me? And sure enough, they did, and it was a grand evening. It was hard for Taft to leave. He had made a huge difference, and he earning the trust of the Filipino people. The key was he listened, he engaged, and he was slowly bringing the Filipinos into the government. Not fast enough for some, a little too fast for others, but all in all, Taft had been the right man in the right place, and things were certainly on track, and he was the main reason why. Set sail on December the 12th of 1903 back to Washington, D.C., not to the Supreme Court, but to the cabinet, a new kind of Secretary of War, and that is the story for another day. That is William Taft, and Duty Calls, Dream Denied, from the life of William Taft. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.